Good evening, everyone. Thank you for taking the time to come to our reparations series, which we've been doing over the last 4 years or more. And that is to talk about our journey towards reparations. As you all know, that in our diocese, what we decided to do on our reparations journey is that we decided to start with education. I know some folks started in different ways, but education was our primary focus in the Diocese of New Jersey. So we've had presenters from Princeton University, from Rutgers University, from nonprofit organizations, other dioceses, to help us as we learn about reparations and to guide us in our thinking, to guide us in our in understanding the broader issue of reparations, not only as it impacts us in the Diocese of New Jersey, but how it has impacted us in the larger church and in the society at large. So I'm very happy today to present uh, Reverend Shaniqua Brokenleg, and he is going to present to us his perspective on reparations from an Indigenous perspective. So with that, I'll have Reverend Paul Kozak introduce Reverend Shaniqua, and then we will turn the presentation over to him for his perspectives. Thank you all again for being here. We appreciate your showing up. Reverend Paul.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Paul Shove Kozak. I'm priest in charge at Cristo Rey, Trenton, New Jersey. And it is a great honor to introduce the Reverend Shaniqua Broken Leg. Uses she, her pronouns. Reverend Shaniqua has been on the presiding bishop's staff for 5 years, approximately. Uh, Prior to ordained, well, let me stay there with the ordained ministry. Reverend Shaniqua is known for leading the podcast Prophetic Voices, preaching and teaching beloved community. Uh, and she's based out of the Office of Reconciliation, Justice, and Creation Care for the presiding bishop. Also serving in the Diocese of South Dakota. If I'm correct. Yes, South Dakota. Reverend Shaniqua was a member of the Lakota tribe. And prior to ordained ministry, Reverend Shaniqua was an epidemiologist. So we are extremely graced by her presence in this webinar. And without further ado, Reverend Shaniqua, the space is yours. Thank you so very much.
Well, thank you for asking me to be here today. It's great to be here with you all. I see some faces of folks that I know and maybe some folks that hopefully will be friends soon. Um, so I'm glad to be here. I have a PowerPoint, so I'll run with that and then there'll be time for questions if you want. So let me go ahead and get started. I can figure out how to do it. Okay, I hope, let's see here. Did that work? Whoops, let me start from the beginning. There we go. Can you all see it? Head nods, perfect, okay.
That looks,
So,
yes, we can see it.
okay, from like the Lakota perspective, we have this idea of Wo Lakota, which I think there's maybe like a Hebrew equivalent, and I'm not going to say the word right, but it's like Sadik or something, but it means kind of like Wo Lakota is the state when all things are in right relationship, when we're in right relationship with ourselves, with each other, with creation, and with the creator. And that's kind of, as I think about what reparations are, it's we're journeying in that direction. Um, and we have another phrase, Mtaku Yasin, which means we're all related. And being of the one creator, the creator made us all, including the earth and the plants and the animals. And so when we say we and relative, we're talking about all of creation, not just humans. And if we think about the Bible, you know, God created all things and said that they were good. And so same thing. We didn't have a concept of evil. We had to actually invent a word for evil when the missionaries came, because it's in the Lord's Prayer. And so we had to be like, what is this thing? And how do we explain that in a way that other folks can understand? So that's sort of the root of where I'm coming from. But then I wanted to talk about some biblical examples of reparations and kind of help us to think about it. And so one is this story of Zacchaeus in the tree, right? And Zacchaeus as the tax collector, and Jesus calls him out, but at the same time also calls him into right relationship, into that woe lakota relationship. And Zacchaeus sort of says, I've done these bad things and I will now change and do X, Y, and Z differently. And Jesus says, okay, well, this restoration has happened. So calling out and calling in, thinking about how do we do that? How do we call out things that may not be great, but at the same time also call folks into relationship? How do we call them out without excluding them? And then this idea of perspective, and this is an image of the Exodus, and I remember doing this at a Deputies of Color meeting. When you think of the Exodus and you think of who you are in that story, who are we in that story? And most people will say, well, we're the Israelites escaping slavery. And if you're an indigenous person and you read that same story, you don't put yourself in the role of the Israelite. You put yourself in the role of the Canaanite. And it totally changes the perspective of what does woe lakota, what does right relationship look like in that story. And as an indigenous person, after we've been moved from our land and genocide and all of that, it definitely changes what reparations might look like from our perspective versus the perspective of a Black person or a Latino or whatever it might be. How does that shift? And it's important to think about our perspectives, even in the same story that we're reading in the Gospels and in the Bible. This is another story that I like to talk about, is the story of the prodigal son and thinking about reparations in that way. So I often talk about this if we think about the church. So the Western white version of the church with its triumphalism and all of that sort of took the shared family resources, right? They took land and children and language and resources and spent them in dissolute living, tied up in feeding the pigs of empire and power and greed and all of that. And I think our church is starting to realize that that's not sustainable. And there is a church that's sort of authentic that people have had, and that might be the family there. And so I think the Western white church is kind of coming back and sort of realizing it. We as folks of color have to decide, are we going to be like the dad and welcome them back? Or are we going to be like the brother and not come into the house because we're angry and upset? And I think that's a really tough question that I don't know. I'm not prepared to answer it, but it's one that I think about really deeply and reflect on as we think about historical trauma and reparations and what that looks like. We don't know the rest of the story, right? We just know Jesus used it as an example. And so it might be interesting to think about what might the rest of that story be. And then this is another one where I struggle and think about as I think about reparations. If we think about Jesus, after Jesus was resurrected, he still had those wounds. He still had those wounds on his side and on his hands or wrists, depending on who you ask. But it was those same wounds that helped Thomas find his faith, right? It was those same wounds that were there. So it wasn't perfect. It didn't come back. It was perfect in the sense it was Jesus and Jesus is perfect. But, he wasn't fully restored in that way, but he still was resurrected and still was holy and did all of those things. And so I think that helps us think about too our own trauma and our own wounds and what Jesus and our faith can do with those, right? Jesus says it's okay to have those wounds. I can still make them holy. I can still make those bad things that happen to you and transform them. So all of that to say, kind of, that gives us some biblical grounding in how we might think about some of these questions. And of course, our church history of broken relationships. So we've got things like the doctrine of discovery and colonization and slavery and boarding schools and racism and shadeism and colorism and whiteousness, which is like the overt and covert white supremacy that's sort of invasive in the church, in our hymnody and in our iconography, and in our choices of things, and it just sort of is pervasive in there. And if you've ever been to a church and seen a white Jesus, that's righteousness. Or you've ever some of that triumphalism songs, Greenland's Icy Mountain Hymn, that is a very righteous song full of colonialism and messiness. And thank God it's not in our 1982 hymnal, but it was in some of the previous ones. Okay, moving on. So historical trauma. This one I just like to explain because I think this is where, when we talk about reparations, where I think the root of the healing can come. So in a healthy society, you have one generation that passes on what I like to think of as their cultural DNA, their culture, parenting skills, customs, language, love, heritage, all of that onto the next generation. And they pass it on to the next generation. And so even though that first generation or previous generations might be gone, that same cultural DNA is what's getting passed on. Think about all the things you learned from your grandmas and grandpas and aunties and uncles and parents and all of that stuff. Were you guys in New Jersey? I don't know what the New Jersey teams are, but are you like a Buffaloes fan, or are you a Vikings fan? Or, what makes a Thanksgiving dinner? Or do you even celebrate Thanksgiving? Or, do you have a posadas at Christmas time or not? And all of that stuff. Those are all sort of superficial examples, but that's sort of the way we can think about those kind of things. How do you handle conflict? Is it like hush whispers and we're passive aggressively sharing things, or do we like yell it out and wait for, Thanksgiving or Christmas to air all the dirty laundry? Or do we, are we conflict avoidant? All of those kind of things. And with historical trauma, something stops that DNA transmission. And with Indigenous folks, it was like boarding schools and government policies. And so while the trauma happened to that one generation, that cultural DNA got messed with. And so instead, what's getting passed on is all of that loss of language, loss of religion, loss of culture, the genocide, the adoption, the death, and all of that. So even though the boarding schools aren't there and the government policies have gotten better, that negative stuff, the suicide, the violence, the abuse, all of that continues to get passed on. And so it's kind of like a cancer where it's like a bad cell that keeps replicating. It's the same thing. Until you heal that cultural DNA, until that bit gets healed, that negative stuff will continue to get passed on to future generations. And so sometimes people will be like, slavery was so long ago, why can't you just get over it? Boarding schools were so long ago, why can't you just get over it? I always tell people, one, depending on your cultural context, it really wasn't that long ago, especially when you measure things in generations versus just a couple years or whatever. And two, until that, let me see if the cursor will move, until this business here gets healed, that will continue to replicate. And so I think when we think about reparations, I think about how are we healing that cultural DNA? What are we doing to make it better? Because we could just throw money at it, which is what some organizations and institutions have done, right? But is that actually solving the problem? Is it actually healing that cultural DNA? Is it helping us to move in the right direction? These are just some pictures of the boarding. This is one boarding school in the town where I used to work. And I always ask people, how many kids in this picture are smiling? And if you look, there's just like one or maybe two here that are smiling. And these are children coming into and out of Carlisle boarding school. So the children on the left are entering Carlisle. They just got off like a 3-day train ride from the Southeast United States. I tell people everything you see that those children are wearing means something. Just like if someone has a ring on this finger, that means something, or this collar means something, right? And they took that all away and they cut their hair. That boy that has like a bandana on his head, that probably means that he went through the rites to become an adult and to be considered an adult in his community. And yet that was taken away from him too. There's other examples of historical trauma, throughout history. We could think about anytime that cultural DNA gets messed with is when that happens. So you've got HIV/AIDS in the LGBT community, you've got the Holocaust, slavery, Japanese internment, even now with the separation of children at the border, all of that stuff can mess with that. And then there's different symptoms of that. The biggest one that I always say is discomfort around certain people. If the church has harmed certain populations, those populations are going to take time to see you not as a representative of the church institution, but to see you as a person. That will take time. Or look at various folks of color and their perceptions of the medical institution, right? With the Tuskegee experiment, and you've got that happened to Indian people too, stuff like that. Okay. So our church's sort of model is this labyrinth model where we have this 4 quadrants. We have like telling the truth, proclaiming the dream, practicing the way, and repairing the breach. And all of those help us to move toward reparations. From an indigenous perspective, at least a Lakota one, we talk about this woe Lakota, that state of all things being in a right relationship. And for us, that word woe at the beginning of that word means it's an action word. All of our words that are action words have that woe at the beginning. And it means we must actively do something to make it happen. It won't just magically occur on its own. And so how are we living into that right relationship, and what might we do? And we can do that through the connection and relationship, deep listening, and conversation. This is called the People's Theory. It was developed at the Phillips Powderhorn Cultural Wellness Center, which is now called just the Cultural Wellness Center out of the Twin Cities. And the downward unhealthy process on the left just says, sort of, as we lose our sense of community and we have this rugged individualism, we lose our culture and we lose our health and we become unhealthy. And then they're saying their other process on the right is, as we develop a sense of community and a philosophy of community, that helps people feel self-worth and increase their interaction with each other, building optimism and building culture and building health. And so as we gain our culture, we gain our health, is kind of the way that they're viewing that. And I think that goes with both spiritual health and physical health. But they would also say emotional and mental as well. So I have just a couple of examples. This is, I'm sure some of you have heard this story. I've told it a couple of times, but in the town where I was in this is in the northwards of Wisconsin, there was this artisan who's in the back of this picture, and he went and approached the school. It's a K-8. It's a public school, but most of the kids there are native from the reservation, and it's on the reservation. And the kids leave when they go to high school, and they do terrible there. They face extreme racism. The girls' volleyball team was undefeated at the Indian school, and when they left and went to the high school, they all tried out for the volleyball team. Not one of them got on the volleyball team, even though they all tried out. That's a perfect example of institutional racism. This artisan came and said he wanted to do something with the kids. The principal, who was white, said, okay, well, let's figure something out. And so they decided they were going to build a canoe. They taught the kids how to take the bark off the tree in a sustainable way. The kids learned about their culture. They learned some of the Ojibwe words for these different things. They're learning about math, they're learning about art, and they build this canoe. And I knew it was happening, but I didn't know where the process was or anything. And then I was coming to lunch one day and I saw these people lining the street. And I was like, what's going on? And they're like, oh, they're putting the canoe in the water. And everybody was so excited. And grandmas were coming out of their house, walking down to the street. And they're just there to cheer those children on. And that moment of this community coming together for the kids, and the kids feeling a sense of pride and a sense of community and a sense of belonging and a sense of love from the community, was kind of like a vaccination. So when they go into the high school, they have this deep core of things that they can believe in. And they put the canoe in the water, and this is them paddling around, and the canoe floated and all of that. And so it was just a wonderful story. And now they incorporated different things throughout the year for the kids to do that are cultural. So in the fall, they learn about how to harvest wild rice and process it. In the winter, they learn about how to spearfish on the ice. And in the spring, they learn about maple syruping or maple sugaring. I can't remember. But anyway, how to use the maple sap for the stuff. That's not my tribe. So I'm not super knowledgeable about all the different things you do. But anyway, you get the idea. This is a church in Canada, Vancouver, and it's in a red light district that has a lot of homelessness, a lot of drug use, a lot of folks addicted to drugs. And this church did a process where they had land and they used the land and they bought a building next door, and they converted the building into a drug and alcohol treatment center. And then they gave that building to the city to run. And they did the same thing to do like housing. So people who need housing could live there. And they kind of did that same process. But they also did a bunch of stuff. There's a huge unhoused indigenous population there. And a lot of them are disconnected from their native communities that are, they call them reserves there, but that would be like the reservations. And so they did this coming home, I'm trying to remember the name of the program, but like a coming home program where they connected indigenous, mostly young people, with elders from the different communities, and they learned about their culture, and they learned about, gained a sense of pride in their community and in their culture, and helped reconnect them with this stuff that they have lost. They also have a staff member that just works, like he's a priest, and all he does is work out in the community with the unhoused folks. And I went there for church, and somebody outside met me, and he's like, "Hi, I'm so and so. I'm security." And you think that he was there to like keep the riffraff out of the church. No, he's there to watch everybody's like shopping carts and their bags and sleeping bags and stuff like that while those people go into the church to attend church. Their thurifer was a former sex worker who got her PhD and did her PhD in something about like concepts of God and spirituality among sex workers in Vancouver. It's very powerful stories. And later, the indigenous community wanted to honor the church, and so they gave them that mask that you see there on the left. And so the church came together and with the indigenous community, and they had the ceremony. And as you can see, the people, the natives there, are wearing their indigenous button blankets, which are the red and the black. And of course, the church is doing the liturgical red to sort of mirror that as they're doing it. It's this wonderful idea of how they're working together and increasing a community there at that church. It's a great example. And again, this church wasn't a church that had a ton of money. And they were just able to leverage some of their land and stuff to do these processes with the housing and things. And they've really been able to make a powerful impact. And they're very Anglo-Catholic at this church, which is another thing. Sometimes we think of the Anglo-Catholics as the frozen chosen, but they're not. They were very like, this is our commitment. This is what we're going to do. As we think about some of the things that we could do, one of the best ways to make sustainable change, at least from my experience in public health and in other ways, is looking at how do we do policy, systems, and environmental changes. Those are going to be the things that will give you the longest lasting structural sustainable change. And so examples of policy change, just quick example, anti-racism training requirement, that we've passed that as a resolution through General Convention. Everybody's supposed to have anti-racism training. That's an example of a policy change. There's others. If we were to have like a procurement and hiring equity policy, who are we contacting with as a diocese or as a church to provide our catering or to provide our cleaning services or any of that? Are we prioritizing BIPOC or folk of color businesses, since we know that they often are discriminated against and not receiving a fair shake when it comes to procurement? And maybe we can help to shift that. That would be a policy that we might have. Like maybe they get, we don't hire until we have bids from at least 3 people that are folks of color, for example, among all the other bids or whatever. You can figure out whatever policy is, but that's an example of a policy. A system change changes the way a system works or operates. A really good example is looking at the discernment and deployment process in churches. As a person of color, especially from a collectivistic society, our discernment process as a church is set up for an inside-out discernment. I believe I am called. And so I talk to my priests, and we have a discernment committee, and they affirm that call. So it's inside, I'm called, then the outside affirms it. But for collectivistic cultures, they don't discern that way. They discern outside in. My community believes I am called. And so they tell me, and I have to affirm that call internally. But our discernment process as a church is set up for that other way. It's not set up for an outside-in discernment. And so if we change the system, how that process works, it could benefit and help those who are different or coming from a different culture. We're not always aware of that. Or also in the deployment process, how are we sending priests out? Are they, does the bishop want them only to work with their own kind, so to speak, or can they work in any congregation? And are the congregations open to it? I don't know how many churches I applied for when I first graduated. Every application I sent out, and I was applying all over, everyone from the South, I would get a call from like whoever's in charge of the search committee, and the call went something like this: how would you feel about serving an entirely white congregation? I'm like, that's okay. My congregation where I lived in Wisconsin was mostly white. It's fine. How would you feel about being the only LGBT person in a very conservative congregation? I'm like, well, that's kind of the congregation I was at before. So you're still interested? I'm like, yes, I'm still interested. And then I would never hear from them again. And it was just how the conversation went every time. But I didn't realize that's the Southern way of saying we don't want you. But because they won't just outright say that. It's this hidden, I don't know. I don't understand the Southern code, but if I did, maybe I would have known better. Anyway, but how are we changing those systems? Those would be examples of systems change. Restorative justice structures would be a systems change. Leadership development pipeline for folks of color would be a systems change, things along that line. And then environmental doesn't mean environment as in like ecology. It means environment as in the space where we exist. And so an example of environmental change would be like music or art from folks of color. How much of that are we using? Is that the majority of what we're using in our worship, or are we mostly using music from dead white people? Looking at that kind of thing. That's an example of, and it would change the environment. Are we incorporating, like if you look at that previous slide, that's an environmental change. Having folks wear their button blankets in the church is an environmental change. Or, if you're at a church and you have a priest of color, I have like a leather beaded stole that I'll wear, even though one of the churches I serve is a white church. However you incorporate that. At our Easter vigil, we told a story. The flood story, we told the Lakota flood story instead of the biblical one, just as a way of shifting things. That would be another example of an environmental change. And looking at how are we repatriating objects, land, and things like that our church owns that maybe it didn't get in an ethical way. That would be another example of an environmental change. Seeing that, like having a plaque that points out something or talks about something, is also an environmental change. Anyway, those are all examples of policy systems and environmental change, and those tend to create sustainable change. If you look at how those little things are overlapping in the Venn diagram, sometimes the way you get a system change is by enacting a policy that changes the system, and so there's overlap on all of those. Okay, two more things, and then I think I'm done. But the y'all know what the golden rule is, which is treat people as you want to be treated. If we're working across cultures and we're thinking about reparations, we also have to think about the platinum rule, which is better, which is treat others how they want to be treated. Sometimes folks just want to get this messy racism stuff off their hands, and so they're like, well, we'll just throw money at them and then it's done. But that might work if you're a very money oriented person, but maybe your culture focuses on relationships or focuses on wanting to fix that cultural DNA that's been disrupted and messed up. And so that might be where we need, like, we have a huge problem with suicide. It's the leading cause of death for American Indians ages about 12 to 30, more than accidents, more than anything else. And we could really use some help with mental health and healing in that way, counseling and stuff. That would probably be way more valuable than money. Anyway, so think about that. And then this is just my little metaphor as we're working across cultures. Anytime you're in a relationship with anybody or a group of relationships, so you could think of like a romantic one, or you could just think of maybe a new relationship between, well, that could be a romantic one too, but a new relationship, let's say, between the Episcopal Diocese of New Jersey and, let's say, an Indian community. everybody who's in that relationship has a hand on the handle of the bucket. And as long as there's water in the bucket, the relationship is sustainable and can last. And the way you add water to the bucket is through shared experiences and doing things together. And that's true for all the relationships too. You want water in that bucket. And as you're walking, because everybody's hand is on that bucket, there's going to be jostling of the bucket and some water will come out. And the trick is how much can you jostle that bucket without dumping out all the water? And those jostling will always happen. If you think about, you know, different cultural faux pas you make. I got invited to somebody's house for Chinese New Year, and the person, I said, should I bring something? They said, bring some flowers. In my infinite wisdom, I was like, well, I'll bring white flowers because they symbolize peace. That was a big mistake. That's the color flowers you bring with death. Anyway, that was a jostle of the bucket, right? But there was plenty of water in there, so the relationship was fine. Anyway, as you're pushing things, so if you're as you're building relationships, maybe you don't jostle the bucket as much, but as you have more water in there, you can jostle a little more. Like if you want to push a little more on some particular thing you want to work together on. Anyway, that's that. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and hopefully that was helpful. And I don't know, I think they said,
Reverend Chaniqua, as we say in Spanish, mil gracias, 1,000 thank yous for that authentic, that poignant, that faithful, and that real presentation. As facilitator, I prepared a few questions, and then as you presented, I think I wrote down another 45 questions that just emerged in your presentation. Before we open it up to the group, there are a few things I wanted to invite you to kind of expound upon more. You noted how, the word Walakota, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, is an action word. It actually, when you said that, I thought of the word for faith in the New Testament, pistis, which is also an action word. So I'm wondering if you could offer, one or two practical actions that the church can take um, to promote reparations as you understand.
okay, the first one I think at the ground level is how are we building relationship with the folks that we have harmed first? Because out of everything, right, that's always the core is relationship. And Jesus gives us great examples of that. If you think of like the woman at the well, or there's tons of examples, but starting with that initial conversation and building relationship would be one. And from there, then we can find out. And from that relationship, we can figure out what communities' needs are, because reparations is going to look different for different communities. And I don't know about New Jersey. South Dakota has no money. So we have churches that don't have running water, don't have electricity. I mean, just the basic things. And so for us, if someone's like, we need money, that's not something that we can do. But we do have other assets. We have land, which we've repatriated to some of the tribes, have various things that we can do in different ways. We also have cachet, right? We as a church or denomination in a state can speak out when things are coming, and we can speak out very powerfully to the government and things like that against certain things, right? For example, and unfortunately, I shouldn't say that. Let me figure out how to word this without getting my butt fired. Our former governor is now the person responsible for immigration and naturalization. And I can say, I guess in a very safe way, she's doing some very unethical things, and deporting people who are legally here at the very least. Anyway, but we could speak out about that. And if something happens in our own community, we can speak out about it too. So I would say figuring out what your assets are and then finding out what the community needs. And through that, you can take action that's going to best serve the community, and making sure that they're always a part of all of it, that's not something that you do to someone, but it's something that we do together, again, because we want to be in right relationship.
You mentioned the unethical things that the previous governor of your state did, the sinful things. And in your presentation, you touched upon some of the sinful things the church did to indigenous peoples. You named one of the hymns that was previously in the hymnal no longer. And I think of uh, I have this image of some of the children at the boarding schools being forced to just write one liturgies again and again and again. So what do you suggest we do with some of these symbols or hymns or parts of our tradition that are actually still in use, even though they have been weaponized previously against, in this case, indigenous peoples or other peoples, persons of color?
Well, I think we need to acknowledge that it happened, right? Our own bishop, who's currently the bishop of South Dakota, he was shocked. I think it was his first winter talk, which is like a gathering of indigenous Episcopalians. And as the bishop of a diocese that's about 60 to 70% native people, he comes to winter talk. He was told, and he served in the town or in the town nearby where Carlisle boarding school was. The like common belief is that it was an orphanage. Like they don't even acknowledge that it was this boarding school that did these horrible things. And that was what he was told when he worked there. And so like he was floored when we told this story and he heard all about it. And so I think we need to acknowledge it, and don't like try and sweep it under the rug. Um, but also we want to lift up, trying to think of the right way to put it, enculturated liturgies and ways of expressing oneself, right?
Mm,
Uh, how do we do that in a way? And I think what happens, and this is where I think some of that white supremacy comes in, is there's this idea that we have to somehow guard the faith. And so if you are the white person thinking you have to guard the faith from the indigenizing of the liturgy, maybe that's not the right thing. Maybe find a different indigenous person who can help navigate that space, rather than thinking that you as this outsider is going to decide what's okay and what's not okay,
mm,
right? I don't know how to express that very well, but it happens a lot. I remember we wanted to do an indigenous liturgy at seminary, and a particular professor started in that from that guarded space, and I called her out on it, and then she kind of backed off. But that was where she was, I need to approve everything. And what does that foreign word mean that you're saying? And I'm like, well, that's our word for God. And it means that, it's like, I shouldn't have to do that. Trust that what I'm doing is coming from the best possible place. But it comes from the space of like, I have the authority and I'm the one in charge, and you're going to do something bad or wrong. That's
mm.
like, it's not coming from a neutral space. It's coming from a very, like, assuming the worst.
Yeah.
And I'm trying to remember, there was another thing I was going to say about your question. What do we do about it? I don't remember. There was something else I was going to say. It'll come up later. But sorry, go ahead.
Well, I want to provide space for our other guests to ask questions. Please put your questions in the chat or raise your hand. I see a question from Frederick. Are there indigenous practices and life ways that we can learn from to build solidarity among persecuted groups and minorities nationwide?
Definitely, definitely yes. Um, I think that idea of that we are all related is really important. We have to realize that, like, I have to realize as an indigenous person that my struggle, right, for like tribal sovereignty is tied up also in someone else's, struggle for, completely on the other side of the world against colonization, or how does that all play together? And so we have to realize that our struggles are together. And if we want to really end racism and the doctrine of discovery, that's all connected. And we have to see how that's connected. How does colonization, how is that connected to patriarchy? How is that connected to misogyny? How is that connected to racism? And how is that, all those things are connected. And we have to realize that our, our God and our community seeks right relationship with everything. You can't have some that are in and some that are out. And if I can't see how refugees and immigrants struggle is connected with my own struggle, I need to figure out how those two things are connected, right?
Mm,
I can't just be like, oh, that's not me. I don't need to worry about that.
mm.
Um,
You, thank you. Are,
I think just, yeah, thinking about how all things are related. That's definitely, I think, a core of my theology and a core of indigenous theology too. And being a good relative as kind of how I translate the core of the gospel. How are we a good relative? Keeping in mind that relative is not just people, but plants and animals and creation.
I see Father Jackson Boney's hand raised.
Hi, Reverend Shanika. Good to see you again. My question is a kind of theological one in terms of what you were just saying about the interrelatedness of everyone and everything. To me, that resonates very deeply with Trinitarian theology, and I'm wondering whether in indigenous communities a connection is made between that worldview of interconnectedness and the Trinitarian tradition of interconnectedness of God.
That's a tricky one because for us, we think of everything in fours. We think of like, four seasons, and medicine wheels are all in fours. And those are core to almost every indigenous community in North America. And so the Trinity idea is kind of a struggle. Not that we can't understand it, but just it's a struggle because it doesn't have four, it's three. And so we want to see those four things laid out. I think the idea of the Trinity being one thing is an easy concept to grasp, because for us, God, one of our words for God, Wakantanka, just means like, most people translate as a great spirit or great holy thing. That word Wakan means sacred, holy, or weird. And then Tanka means big, powerful, or strong. And so Wakantanka is like the big, powerful, holy thing. It's never meant to be understood. God and ceremonies aren't meant to be understood. They're meant to be experienced, would be how we would probably frame that. And so our understanding of the Trinity might be like, this is somebody else's thought about it. Have we experienced that or not? And I think for us, we would probably say it's definitely, we've experienced it. We might not have experienced Jesus in person, right? But we experience Jesus in the person of the Eucharist and in the storytelling that we've heard about it, and in the anamnetic statement making Jesus present there, right? And so we can think about it that way. And same thing with God as the creator. We know that we're here. We might not have experienced God the creator in some concrete way. And we can, the Holy Spirit's probably the easiest one for us to sort of lean on, because it's a mystery. We don't always know where she's going and how she's doing it, or even if she's a she, right? Same thing with God. We have some words for God that are male related, and some that are female related, and some that are neutral. And in Lakota, there are no pronouns. So we don't have like, our language doesn't have pronouns. You just, if you're a boy, you speak one way. If you're a girl, you speak one way. And if you're two spirit like me, I might be male bodied, but I speak like a woman. So
I don't see any other hands. I'm going to then throw another question at you, kind of combining two things you talked about. You talked about how, because of historical traumas, the cultural DNA has been impacted of certain groups. And so ideally, a process of reparations works to restore, to heal that. And as you were saying that, I thought of the word, in our tradition that we commonly use, salvation, right? The root of it is healing, health. And then you mentioned at the beginning, as an example from the biblical tradition, the story of Zacchaeus. And so for Zacchaeus to have his health restored, he had to do X, Y, and Z. So for us as a church to have some of our health restored, to discover our salvation again, particularly in this framework of reparations, are you able to offer anything that we can do to make amends, to make recompense in the same way Zacchaeus might have intended to?
I think, well, one, figuring out what restoration might look like. What would a resurrected church look like, right? Because it would still probably have some of those wounds. We're never going to completely get rid of them, but what does it look like? And to me, it looks like the people in the butts in the seats on Sunday are going to match the demographics of those butts are going to match the people in our communities where we live, right? Mm-hmm. If we come to church on Sunday and the community we live in is 60% brown and tan and Black folks, but the butts in the seats on Sunday morning is 90% white, that does not look like that does not look like Woe Lakota. And that might be the thermometer we use to measure it, right? And I would say, if I were coming into a worship service, at least in my community, obviously I wouldn't come to New Jersey and expect it to look like this. I would expect to see things that tell me that my culture is accepted and welcomed here, right? Like the star quilt. Plenty of our churches have star quilts hanging up, or sometimes they use them as frontals for the altar. That's like a sign that that's part of my culture. It's a piece there, right? And so I would want to see little bits of that, and how are those things expressed in the figuring out what that looks like. And that again would be an environmental change if I was going back to and then I would think about how are we writing some of those things that we have done. I think one of the questions is, like, as an Indigenous person, what about your land? How are you using your land? How is it in your space? What does that look like for folks, Indigenous folks? What does that look like for folks of color? A lot of folks of color were not allowed to buy homes, and redlining and all of that. How are we making that land available and helping to house folks or somehow fix that issue? But again, building relationship and talking to them to find out what it is that they need, and what would help heal that core, because that's going to be highly contextual based on where you are and your population. But I'd also think about, like, knowing the history of what happened. Did you put money into boarding schools, and what does that look like to fix it? I think I remember something I was going to say about that, and that was just, there's a school that was a Indigenous boarding school in Pine Ridge called, it used to be called Holy Rosary. We called it Roly Hosiery when we played them on basketball. But anyway, but they now changed their name to Red Cloud Indian School. And one of their big things is this reconciliation. And they have another word they use for it, and reparations. And so they, because they wouldn't let the children speak the Lakota language, now they have immersion daycare where kids are taught and do all the interaction in Lakota. And then they have an immersion school where the kids are learning Lakota there. And they have, like, all of these things that they're trying to right these wrongs based on what the community is sort of saying that it needs. And it's really neat to see how they've shifted and worked to do that.
Are there others that wish to ask a question? I can keep them coming from my end.
I'll ask a question.
Thank you, Annette.
Yes. Given that we're in a anti-DEI climate, I mean, not only nationwide, but also in our churches, and it's similar to the question that Paul asked of you, what from an educational perspective do we need to do in our church to allow us to understand the climate and to change it? Does that education have to be in the form of our liturgy or weekly services, confirmation? Just from a formation perspective, what would you suggest?
So there's this thing called the trans theoretical model. It's the fancy
Big word.
fancy pants word, but they use it in public health and other things. And it kind of looks like a spiral. And I didn't anticipate this question, so I don't have a slide of it. But basically, it says that you're in one of several states. So you can be in what's called a pre-contemplation state, a contemplation state, a preparation state, an action state, or a maintenance state, or a relapse state, I guess. And it's typically used when we're talking about alcoholism, drug addiction, or some sort of change that we want someone to make. But it also works very well for community change too. And so right now, I would say our society had taken action. They were pre-contemplation would be like slavery and boarding schools and all of that. And their contemplation might be, this isn't working right now. And then preparation is they're getting ready and they're putting all these laws together and they're trying to figure out how they're going to do it, and they're protesting. And then the action is when they pass the law or change the thing. And then if you go roll backwards, that's a relapse, return to old behavior. The benefit of the trans-theoretical model says that even though you've relapsed, you still have all the knowledge that you've learned from the previous times that you can educate yourself with to help as you make the change to move forward again. And you can move yourself through those cycles, or your community through those cycles, based on the spot that you're in. So if you're in pre-contemplation, which, let's say I'm alcoholic and I am not ready to quit drinking and I don't even realize I have a problem, that's pre-contemplation. And so the way you change that is through awareness raising and education. And so that helps someone move themselves from pre-contemplation to contemplation. Oh, I might have a problem. I maybe I am an alcoholic or whatever. And then you can move somebody from that, again, by helping them make choices and see a healthier, like educating them about what positive thing could happen if you make that change, and getting them ready and building their self-efficacy, so then they can move into the preparation stage. Like, okay, I need to quit drinking. Here's how I'm going to make sure, I need to reserve myself a spot at the treatment facility or whatever. And then when you're in that stage, you want to, I'm trying to remember the one. Once you're there, most everybody just kind of breathes a sigh of relief. But then you don't always, then you want to move them into this maintenance phase. They don't just relapse. And I think that's about how do we support what's going on and make sure that it's bolstered, and creating an environment to make the I'm going to use right choice, but right's probably not the right word. The right choice, the easy choice. And so if we think about how we're relapsing now, the things that should be doing based on that model are going to be education and awareness about the harms that are happening as a result of this losing of DEI. Why is it important? Who's being affected? Raising people's voices, make sure we're telling the stories of the communities that are being harmed, the stories of people who've been impacted by these negative things, that kind of piece. And then moving on to the next thing and getting them ready. And we can push some of that into doing it by saying creating a policy again for whatever it is, whatever DEI we want or we need. And those could be in the form of laws, state laws, government laws. It could also be in the form of resolutions at our church or diocese. I'm hoping, Annette, I'm really hoping that our church doesn't just fall back and just mirror what the government is doing. I really want our church to step up and be like, no, we are going to do this. And this is our commitment to the thing. I don't care what so-and-so says. This is what we're going to do. And I think we can do that. And in the past, when we have done that, that is where I think we have shined and where we have brought people in. The Sunday after Marion Buddy gave her speech and called Donald Trump out to like have compassion, we had like 5 new people who were Catholic that showed up on church that Sunday. And I was like, who are these people? And that might not seem like a lot, but at a church that has the ASA of like 25 or 30, that's a lot. And so I'm like, hi, and you introduce yourself and they're like, oh, we just really liked what was said. We wanted to come and we're sick and tired of we have a lot of Christian nationalism in the Catholic Church in South Dakota. And so they're like, we heard that and we wanted to try an Episcopal church. And I was just lucky that they came to ours. Anyway, and then even better yet, they are way better evangelists, I think, than some of us, because they got some of their Catholic friends who then came in the future Sundays. And so now we've got like about 15. And I'm just like, whoa, they don't all come every Sunday because they're kind of shopping around right now. But it's getting them in the door. And it's because we have taken a stand on in a way that is wo lakota, in a way that's in right relationship, and what does it mean and what it means, and not just been like, oh, we have to do blah 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 because so and so said. Sorry, long soapbox I got off of.
And someone put the trans whatever model in the text for us.
Oh, perfect.
Thank
Okay.
you, Rosalie.
I
Oh,
want to
Linda.
thank Rosalie for putting the model in the chat. I think we're down to one question. We're going to lean into our Easter season. Reverend Shaniqua, what gives you hope that we, the Episcopal Church, can continue to move forward and faithfully, honestly, uh, fostering reparations?
That is a good question. I'm going to answer Linda. Linda asked what the name of that school was. That's
Oh, I apologize. I missed Linda's question.
Red Cloud Indian School, and my friend works there. She's not Christian. She's traditional Lakota. Like she does sun dancing and all of that kind of stuff. And she was like, if they're committed to reparations and reconciliation, I should be able to step up to the plate too. And I remember she posted on her Facebook, she's like, posted a picture of the inside of the church sanctuary. And she's like, oh my gosh, I'm sitting through mass. And she's like, don't worry, I didn't take communion. I need to be ready to come. And she's like, anyway, it's very funny. Well, I thought it was, but anyway, the question about hope is really tough for me right now. I've been struggling with hope. And I think if I were to be honest, just given what's going on in our world, in our society, and the dumpster fire that it is, I preached like the darkest Easter Vigil sermon. And what I kind of talked about was the women who were coming with the spices to anoint Jesus's body. They were doing what needed to be done because of the relationship they had with Jesus, because they loved Jesus. They didn't come expecting resurrection, but is in while they were doing that work of love and what needed to be done, that is when they found out about the resurrection. That is where this amazing thing happened. And I think it wasn't because they were hopeful that he suddenly was going to be alive. And I wish we could have interviewed them just before they had gotten there to kind of get a sense of where they were at. They may have lost hope, but it was in that moment that that happened. And I think, and the same thing in the past, right? With all those bad things that happened, at least from my context, Native people, right? We continued to tell the stories. We continued to sing the songs. We continued to say the prayers, and we continued to survive. And I think it's doing what needs to get done. The fortitude and perseverance is maybe what I'm saying. It's one of our Lakota virtues. That's kind of where we're at. We have to continue to do that and not, I won't say not necessarily lose hope, but continue to do it anyway. Do what needs to get done anyway. I'm thinking of what's her name's book, the Hallelujah Anyhow. But the thing where I get most excited about, where I get really energetic and energized about, are when I see communities doing transformative work, engaging in churches doing transformative work in their community, where they're not just sitting on their butts on Sunday morning, but they're like active and doing stuff outside of their walls. That's number one. And then there's moments at church where I just get so moved, and it's often with the children. Like I have one of the churches I serve, the Indian congregation. I have these kids, and they love to acolyte, they love to help. They don't always do it correctly, but it's not about doing it correctly. But I just want them to then, have fun and not feel like they're getting yelled at or anything. So, sometimes they walk around and, antsy, and they don't always hold their hands like this, but, they're carrying the cross, and they're like young, like 10 and whatever. Anyway, at Easter, they wanted to help with the asperges, and all of them wanted to help. And so we had to like talk about what it meant, and that it wasn't just throwing water on people, and they each got a turn. And there was this moment where the littlest kid, who's like a toddler still, he barely talked, but he wanted to do it too because his brother and sister were doing it. And so I gave him the little thing, and we were using, I think, a palm branch or something. And he like dipped into the water and like gently patted the head of the oldest member of our community, this matriarch in our congregation. And I was just like all emotional and all teary-eyed. I'm like, oh, like I'm trying not to be all emotional at that moment. And it reminded me of the cycle of life. And and the next year she passed away. Like she wasn't there this Easter when we did that again. But I get hope from seeing the joy that they have, and that they're learning about the things, and they're telling the stories, and we're sharing that and carrying that on to future generations. And that we're not repeating the harms that happened, right? Like I want them to enjoy church. I'm not coming and be like, you will sit down and you will cross yourself like this and you will, like it's not that. It's how are we building your relationship with Christ in a way that is life-giving for you, and in a way that helps us all live better. That's where I get hope.
Wow. Deep. I would invite us all to conclude with a prayer this deeply moving, honest webinar. May God be with you.
And also with you.
Oh God of life, we thank you for Reverend Shaniqua, and you are so well pleased. We thank you for the participants in today's webinar, and you are also so well pleased. We thank you for the resilience of oppressed peoples in this nation, indigenous peoples, enslaved peoples. May we learn to honor their resilience by building a kingdom that is just and filled with hope. Prevent us from relapse, and should we relapse, may it be short-lived. Empower us to discover our own health, our own salvation by building relationships with others, not as simply we would want them to treat us, but how they would want to be treated in these relationships. May we continue to embody the hope of an Easter people. May we love Jesus in the ways that we know how to, and in doing so, may we discover your resurrection again and again, even if our resurrected body still shows and bears the wounds of sin. We offer up this prayer in hope through the wonderful and irrepressible Holy Spirit. Amen.
And thank you so much.
If there's a deacon in the house, a deacon could give us a dismissal. Deacon Theodore, please.
For us all, go in peace to love and serve the Lord. Hallelujah.
Thanks be to
Thanks
God.
be to God.
Hallelujah. Hallelujah.
Thank you, Reverend Shaniqua. Bye-bye.